Everybody, welcome to this webinar on cash flow and why your contract is killing it, how to stop it, all that goodness. My name is Justin Gittleman. I'm here with Levelset, and very excited to have Sean Dowsing, who's the Senior Counsel at Manning & Cass, as well as Michael Carson, Director of Surety Claims at Nationwide, to present this topic. So if you want to go to the next slide, I'll just kind of mention, for those who don't know what Levelset is, we help contractors and suppliers get paid by sending notices and payment paperwork electronically, finding accurate job site details, giving alerts for when payment problems arise, and a lot more. But we're not here to talk about Levelset, so I just wanted to welcome everybody in here to this presentation, and I'll just hand it off to Sean and Michael.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name's Sean Dowsing. I am from Manning & Cass, and our webinar today is about cash flow and some contract clauses that are going to affect it. So kind of the agenda for the day is we're going to do a quick introduction of who Mike and I are, talk a little bit about the importance of cash flow, but really the meat and the potatoes of this presentation is going to be a discussion of cash flow affecting clauses in your contract and some risk reduction strategies. So again, my name is Sean Dowsing. I'm an attorney that represents exclusively contractors and subcontractors. I work primarily in public and private construction. I've got some in-house experience for when I used to work at a underground contractor.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Carson. I'm currently Director of Surety Claims at Nationwide Mutual Insurance Company. I have experience in public construction, private construction. I was a former in-house counsel with a construction company. This might be a good time for me to also say that the views expressed by me today are not necessarily the views of Nationwide Mutual Insurance Company and are my own personal views. Sean, back to you.
All right, so hoping this switched over for everybody, but talking about the importance of cash flow. And I think it goes without saying, but cash flow is really important for contractors. If owners pay general contractors can pay their subs and suppliers. So it moves through the whole project, starting with the owner. So a lot of our discussion today is how to make sure you get paid. But typically, I think when Mike and I start seeing issues with companies, whether it's a surety takeover, a project, or contractors that are in default, it's almost always at its heart a cash flow problem. And it's usually not a cash flow problem just from one job. It's usually 2, 3, 4 jobs that are having issues that all of a sudden put this company in a difficult position. And we've seen a lot of that lately with the pandemic putting a hold on projects, and then all of a sudden all the projects starting up at once. So maybe you had 4 projects that you thought you were going to do over a 2-year period, and now you're doing them over a 1-year period. So there's a lot of acceleration, there's more labor costs, there are increased material costs, which we're going to have a pretty good deep dive into that. But we're starting to see a lot of it, and it is generally from a confluence of project problems and cash flow.
And so with that in mind, I'm sure a lot of us are seeing how, as a result of the pandemic, a lot of jobs were pushed from last year to this year, or even I have jobs that were from the fall of 19 and pushed until, recently. And the result is that people are having multiple jobs at the same time. And how are people, the question is, how are you going to deal with those situations? Where multiple jobs starting at the same time, whether it's labor, materials, et cetera. And again, all those affect the cash flow.
Right. So price escalation. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Mike.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that from time to time during this presentation, I'll be introducing just how the surety sort of sees these matters, as which might be unique and things that you haven't thought about. But to the extent it's a public project or a bonded private project. And obviously, as we're going through this, if you have questions about that, if you please raise your hand, and we can sort of try to answer those questions to the extent we can, or see that you raised your hand, we can address those issues. Go ahead.
Right. So the first topic, the first kind of meat and potatoes topic we want to get into is price escalations. And that has been the talk of the town in construction. It has been the hot topic on, I think, just about every webinar or conference or article you read, price escalations. So what we're talking about here is when you as a contractor or subcontractor have bid a project using a certain amount of money for wood or various metals, fuel, PVC even, and more recently labor. But then by the time you actually have to order those materials or by the time you have to start construction, the price has gone up. So who bears that risk? And the chart to the right, and there's a lot of charts like it, but the chart to the right just kind of shows what this price escalation looks like. So that is the price per ton of hot rolled steel. And if you look pre-pandemic, in the red circle, it was about $450 to $500 per ton. Middle of the or not middle, but early in the pandemic, in the June, July of 2020, it rises to about 600 per ton. And then all of a sudden, end of 2020 into 2021, it goes up to 1,200. So you're looking at 100% price increase in less than a year. So what is the effect of that on your contract? If you're a subcontractor who's a sheet metal guy, or maybe you're an underground contractor installing steel pipe, or a framer framing a apartment complex, what does that do to your project? It reduces or eliminates your profit and your markup. Might put you in the red if there's enough material on job. And in the worst case scenarios, we see contractors who are in default because they can't build the project any longer for the price that's out there. So one of the first things that I think, if you have to deal with Mike, or you have to deal with me, that we're going to ask if you're dealing with a price escalation change order is, what caused the delay? When was your contract executed? What caused the delay? If you got delayed for a year and all of a sudden you're in 2021, well, maybe that price escalation isn't your fault, and we need the owner or the general contractor to pay for that. Now, getting them to pay is a different story, but it's not your issue, and we got to kind of work our way through that. So I want to talk a little bit about an example of what this looks like. So imagine you are a sheet metal subcontractor, you're working on roofing and flashing, and you sign your contract in January of 2020. So COVID's around at that point. It's in China primarily, but it's around. It's in the news. And then all of a sudden, COVID hits the US. There are shutdowns, there are project delays, and now your work doesn't start until April 2021, and you've suffered a 100% increase in material costs. Wiped out your contract profit, and now you're financing this project as a contractor or subcontractor. So if you called up Mike or me, the first thing we're probably going to ask you after the delays is, let's see your contract. Does your contract even talk about price escalation? How would we handle this? More often than not, contracts don't talk about price escalation. They say something pretty vague, like in the upper right, where it says contractor is responsible for delivering the work in accordance with the lump sum price. Now, I would bet you a paycheck that if your GC or your owner has read the contract and you come in asking for a change order for a price escalation, they're going to beat you over the head with this contract clause saying, well, you accepted the risk. It was lump sum. So figure it out, work on disputed work, and bug me for a claim later. The flip side of that could also be if you have a unit price contract, maybe with a subcontractor or a supplier of some kind, maybe somebody hauling dirt. And very often those types of contracts go the other way, where they will have an increase of 5% or 15% or 20%. At that time, then the parties have to renegotiate the units. So that kind of goes the other way. So kind of the tip and trick of this is if you are negotiating a contract right now and price escalation is an issue and it's going to be on your mind, it's on your owner's mind, and it's on your contractor's mind, your GC's mind, is try and come up with a clause in your contract that's balanced. And the same would go true if you're dealing with a change order situation. If you've got 100% material price increase and you're trying to figure out how to pay this, try and come up with a balanced approach. We found that it's been the most successful that way. And it starts with a recognition that somebody is paying for this material price increase, whether that is the owner, the GC, or a subcontractor. Somebody does pay for it. At the end of the day, somebody pays the piper. So what we've proposed and been successful with, and it's kind of helped cash flow moving on contracts so our subs and clients aren't financing entire projects, is that the contractors and subcontractors are responsible for price increases to a point. Maybe that's 5%, maybe it's 10% or 12%. After that point, the owner has to pick up the tab because it's ultimately their project. But the owner does not have to pay profit and markup on the amounts over the 10%. That way, the owner knows that they can still get their project done. It was a price of fish situation that the got unlucky and the price of steel went up or the price of wood went up, but you're not paying a 15 or 18 or 22% markup to your contractors as they procure material. We found that in change order negotiations, that has been a effective tool to keep money flowing towards the contractors and subcontractors so they're not financing big material increases. Switch slide there.
So I'm sure over the past year, we've all heard about these force majeure clauses. And, obviously these are important contract clauses. Now, I've been an attorney for 25 years or so. Never had a force majeure clause issue. Never happened. Most attorneys never had that happen. Never thought about them, although they were always included. So big picture, the idea of a force majeure clause is that it's an act of God, and when do we deal with those issues? Tornadoes, hurricanes, etc. But the pandemic has brought this issue into the mainstream, and so whether it's scheduling weddings, ordering parts from China, labor costs. The question is what falls under this force majeure. So what you need to do is you need to look at these clauses and think about how do they help you, how do they hurt you, how can the owner pay more as a result of it. Now, most people are just going to say, well, I have a force majeure clause, therefore you owe me more money. And again, as Sean was just saying, you need to think about when was it executed. But I think it goes more than that. And it's not just a was it foreseeable at that time, but what was foreseeable? The pricing, as we all know, the pandemic, what was it, March 11th? I always think about when the NBA closed down, but what was the date of that? And then when did the price increase hit? So, we look at if on the supply bond, maybe you're supplying lumber, right? Well, that didn't hit in March. That didn't hit for many months later. How about the meat if you had a supply bond for meat? Well, that didn't hit in March. That was what, in July or August when everybody rushed out and bought as much steak and, beef as they could. All right. Well, I know that I had to do some work for my HVAC in my house, and my contractor was telling me, hey, you know what? These prices are going to go up because China shut down. So therefore, there was a supply issue in March. Did you consider that? Who knows? Now, the next part is, what about labor? Well, when did we know that there was a labor cost, a labor shortage? I don't know, January of this year, February of this year. I'm not talking about superintendents and whether or not you had a superintendent, but just your daily most inexpensive labor force. When did that happen? And that's what you need to think about. Now, I have jobs in Florida where they can't get PVC. We all know that lumber tripled in price. I mean, I think at one point a piece of plywood was up to $125, up from $30. Did somebody envision that when they were pricing it? What if you had a contract that you signed in December of 19? It was delayed because of the pandemic, started, in February of this year. How does that work? Now, I think that you can make a good argument for a escalation for that, and try to argue it under your force majeure clause, and maybe you'd be successful that way. I don't know if we want to get into any of the other issues right now, Sean, or put them on the back burner.
No, we can just have, if somebody's got questions on them, they're going to pop up again later. So we'll move on to retention. So retention is not often thought about as a cash flow issue because it comes at the end of a job. And what retention is at its heart is an owner is withholding 5 to 10% of the total contract price. And they're holding that money for defects or labor issues. So if there's a defect after the work is done, that they've got some amount of money that they can draw on in case the contractor went bankrupt or can't finish or can't come back and warranty the work. They've got some amount of money that they can draw on to fix it. Also comes up with labor, where if a contractor wasn't paying their superintendents or their laborers or operating engineers or carpenters, and there's a Department of Industrial Relations issue, that's when the retention can come in handy. So typically retention is withheld until the end of the project, and it's the project as a whole and not just your section, which can be an issue if you're a subcontractor. So if you're building an apartment complex and you are the site preparation contractor, you're grading the area and maybe doing some underground utilities, your retention, 10% of your total contract, which represents a good chunk of your overhead profit markup, is going to be withheld till that apartment complex is finished, unless you've negotiated your contract otherwise. But that creates the cash flow issue in the sense that you can have this kind of nebulous idea where somebody has 10% of my total contract, but I can't get to it. I'm illiquid because 10% of my contract is out there, and that's a good chunk of my profit. So where we see this come up quite a bit is when contractors are in trouble, they're defaulting on a contract, they can't staff it, and they just need money. They need money to keep a contract going. So one of the first questions that we'll typically ask is, well, who owes you money? You say that you need $500,000 to finish this project. And I know from Mike's perspective and from a surety perspective, they want the principal to finish the job. So if you need money, one of the first questions we're going to ask is, well, does anybody owe you retention anywhere else? Can we go chase some of that down? And
so, Sean, let me just cut you off for a second. So how do you handle the situation where a sub-supplier won't wait, is causing you grief despite the contract terms, right? Because we all know what retention is, and we all know that people want their retention. So, want to maybe share with the group some of the tricks of the trade in these situations.
So if you are a subcontractor, you've got your own subcontractors, you're a GC that you're withholding retention on, and they are just coming after you, it's a thorn in your side, they're bugging you for their retention. And your contract doesn't really talk about it. It just says, hey, we're going to withhold retention until the end of the project. You're in an okay legal position, could be tenuous for a few reasons. But one of the things that I would really, really encourage somebody to do at that point is start looking up the food chain. So if you're the GC, maybe approach that owner and say, hey, can we reduce retention? I've really got to get this subcontractor paid. He's a small business, whatever arguments you come up with. I really want to get them paid their retention. Their work is done. We've punch listed them out. We don't need to hold retention. And more often than not, I would venture to say 75, 85% of the time, owners will release that portion of retention and you can get them out. It's just a matter of actually doing it and actually approaching them. So when you're negotiating a contract, if you're a GC on a private project, let's say, because at that point you can negotiate retention. It's not mandatory by any stretch of the imagination. Or you're a subcontractor negotiating your retention with the GC. Think about retention reduction at certain project milestones. So again, going back to the apartment complex example, if you're the site preparation contractor, maybe in your subcontract, you want your retention to be mostly released, maybe down to 1% or $10,000, whichever is less, once you finish the site preparation and the building slab is in. You know, that would be a good approach. But you want to try and have retention reduced at certain definable project milestones. So that way, cash flow is not impacted and it keeps moving through. Something to watch out for in your contract, which is going to impact your cash flow and how you can get your retention, is what's in quotes there. Complete. What does that mean? If your contract says you're going to get retention when the project is complete, is that your section of the project? Is it when the whole project is complete? And does that mean substantial completion? Does it mean when a tenant to move in? Is it beneficial occupancy? So define out that term in your contract to try and make sure you can get paid your retention at certain project milestones. Now
I was just going to say, there's always that debate on, you know, substantial completion, final completion, punch list, done. What does that mean? When is money really due? And I have a job right. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so you wanted to find that out when you're negotiating your contracts. But go ahead, Mike, I cut you off.
Yeah, and so I mean, and I'm sure we've, you know, I mean, I know I have a few projects right now where, you know, the issue is my contractors finished their job of work, but it's you know, they were the excavation company, and now, you know, we've got to wait 2 years to get their retention released. And so nothing's ever set in stone, I think is what Sean was really getting at. And everything's negotiable. And by the way, if you really want your money, maybe you offer a discount and then you get paid.
Yep.
And
so it's all about cash flow.
Right. Right.
So the last 2 points, number 3 and 4, I saw some clients on here that had jumped in, so they're probably getting some heart palpitations. We talked about this a little bit. Retention is held for defects and disputes. So an owner can withhold retention even after the project is done if there's a good faith dispute. But what we do see is owners using retention as leverage. So they say, hey, we think you owe us some nominal amount of money for some vague defect that they don't really describe. And then they start coming back and say, well, we'll pay you your $275,000 in retention. We'll pay it quickly. We'll let the any defect claims go. Just waive your material escalation cost claim against us, or waive your change condition claim against us. So they use it as leverage to get contractors and subcontractors to release other monetary claims. And they just come up with, again, some nebulous idea of there's a defect out there, so we have to withhold all the retention. So in California, that is illegal. You can't do that. You can only withhold 150% of the disputed amount. But again, that without getting a judge involved or a mediator involved, it's hard to convince an owner that what they're doing is bad faith. So in that sense, if you're bumping into that with an owner, you're bumping into that with a general contractor, and they're just not giving you any info about why your retention's not being released or what this so-called dispute is. Start thinking about ratcheting it up a little bit. Maybe your retention claim is going to include interest and attorney's fees. I'll say out here in California, the statutes allow for interest and attorney's fees. So if somebody doesn't pay retention and they lose, they owe 10% interest and they got to pay all the attorney's fees. And that's just a way to kind of ratchet things up a little bit if you're dealing with that bad faith owner who isn't paying your attention when it's due. And I hope it doesn't happen for most people. Like I said, I saw a couple clients on here that are probably getting some heart palpitations because they have either dealt with this recently or are dealing with it right now. All right, so move on to dispute resolution clauses and change orders and claims.
Sure. So, and I'm just seeing there's a question. Why don't we, Debbie, we will get to that in a minute, okay? I promise you on that. So let's talk about change orders, claims, and dispute resolution next. So this is where the most money is held up, right? You have a contract, you're asked to do X, and all of a sudden there's a big change order, and you don't want to do it. You don't really care to do it because you're sort of done with this owner, but you're going to do it anyway. And then what happens? You do the work, and then there's an argument over whether it's in scope or out of scope. There's an argument about whether or not you should be, how much you're going to get paid, how that's all going to work out. And the end result is that you're waiting and waiting and waiting. And so if your claim gets denied, or your change order gets denied, there's a claim, and that claim can usually go through a dispute resolution procedure, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but you're waiting for the review, and you're looking at endless meetings, and the other side drags their feet. So the most important thing, is obviously document. That's what we always talk to our, to our bonded principals about. But this is where the most money is held up. We talk about mediations; they're expensive, but they might be your best investment. Sean has talked to me about early mediations. Maybe even just 4 hours. I know with a former surety I was with, we used to have mediators on staff where they would do 1 hour of mediation for, it was like $250. And the idea was, super cheap, get in, get out, see if you can resolve some issues. I always like to put, while people might not be able to mediate today, let's set a time, let's set a date for it 30 days from now. At least we have a date and we're moving forward, and maybe we're talking in the interim.
I want to run through an example real quick of kind of why a lot of money can get tied up in these dispute resolution clauses. And by the way, this is an example from an actual dispute resolution clause that we deal with. So imagine that you're a site prep underground contractor. Your as-builts were all wrong, and you're building an apartment complex, and there's just unmarked utilities everywhere, and they're mismarked. So it takes 50% longer to do the job. You go to your general contract and you say, hey, I got to submit a change order for this because it took way more. The plans were all screwed up. This took a lot longer, was a lot more expensive. GC says, hey, keep working, submit it as a claim. So in this particular instance, the GC had 30 days themselves to review the change order. Once they denied the change order, then our subcontractor had to submit a claim. And the GC had another 30 days to review it before submitting it to the owner. Now the owner has 30 days to review that claim as well, because now it's a claim from the GC. And then finally, there had to be a manager's meeting after the owner's review. And then there was a mediation clause. And the mediation clause had to come after the manager's, or the mediation had to come after the manager's meeting. So even assuming we can move as fast as we possibly could, everything is 30 days and nobody drags their feet, you're looking at financing this claim for 120 days, at least. It's probably more likely 6 months, not 4 months, realistically. Mike's going to talk a little bit about how to negotiate some contract terms and how to maybe shorten this process up a little bit. But on this slide, what I would say is one of the best things you can do for yourself is to do a good job on your change order, your initial change order. Put the work in up front. And what I mean by that is a change order for change conditions should be accompanied by daily reports. And the daily reports need to be good. They need to be well written. They need to hit the 5 W's of the day: who, what, where, when, why, how. They shouldn't just say installed sewer pipe today or painted walls today. They need to say how many square feet of paint you were doing, what floor you were on, what plans you were working off of, what crew members were there, and describe in detail any issues that happened that day. Accompanying that daily report needs to be a T&M ticket. So a time and materials ticket that says, hey, this is how many extra hours I had to work, how much extra material I had to use, and here's how much it costs. Now you need to get your GC, or if you're the GC, you get the owner to sign that ticket. And they can sign it and say, hey, I dispute it. I don't agree with it. I don't think that this is extra work, but they need to acknowledge that you actually did that work and saying, hey, it's a signature for acknowledgement only. So ideally, you've got some photos too that can accompany this. Package those things up and send those in as a change order. And the reason why that's going to speed the process up is you're not going to have a GC rejecting it or an owner rejecting it saying, hey, I don't have enough info. You didn't give me daily reports. I don't know what you were doing that day. You're not going to bump into a mediator or a judge saying, you're asking for 800,000 and you've got no daily reports to back this up. What gives? Do the work up front, work with your superintendents, work with your foreman to make sure they know how to document the claim when they see that situation popping up.
My apologies. I think my video went off.
Oh yeah, you're frozen on my screen, but I can hear you.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on. Probably. Well, what would a Zoom meeting be without a frozen or a kid walking in? All right. Well, I will try to work through this. All right. So claims dispute resolution.
You gonna go through the slides, Mike?
Hang on a second. I'm back. I might be back in. I don't know. I apologize. Do you want me to continue on this? All right. So let me talk about this one. My apologies, everybody. All right. So the important thing is to, when you're talking about your claims dispute resolution, you need to look at the review times, as Sean was just talking about. So maybe somehow you are able to shorten it through negotiations from 4 weeks to 6 weeks, or it's 4 weeks to 2 weeks. And just because the contract says, well, it's 4 weeks, if you're entering into a change order that you're not comfortable with, maybe you can say, all right, listen, we'll do this, but I want to have this, the time frame reduced from 4 weeks to 2 weeks. And, and again, because everything is negotiable at that point, maybe they'll agree. Asking for mediation dates earlier in the process, as I was talking about earlier. If you can submit your claim earlier and submit it for payment, maybe then you can get your statutory interest accruing earlier. And again, in California it might be 10%, but I think doesn't it go up to 18% or something in California, Sean?
It can in certain municipalities and things, yeah.
For your prompt payments.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So so always be thinking about that. Of course, establishing rates and considering your bond rights. If somebody just isn't willing to pay for a change order, consider leaning the project up. Obviously, if it's a bonded project, you won't be able to do that, but you may have other rights under the bond. Sometimes, submitting a payment bond, at least it depends on the size of the GC. A larger GC might not care, a smaller GC might, if you file a payment bond. And then remembering who your contract is with. So, as Sean was saying earlier, perhaps, notifying the owner, the developer who might be above the GC, maybe they can help you in resolving some of these issues. Keep in mind always your contractual obligations to submit a claim. Some are limited to 3 days. Some, super short timeframes, right? And that can always be a problem as well. So always, as you enter into clear contract change order work, consider what that might mean. So while on the one hand, you want to try to decrease your dispute resolution process, you might want to increase your time frame in order to make a claim. And then if you're going to mediate something anyway, get in contact with the other side and see if you can get a mediation date set. If they say no, it's a good indication that maybe they're going to drag their feet and then you need to reconsider your position. I can tell you from a surety's perspective, we want you to finish the project, to go and do the change order and work through it. It's always good to have, in court, clean hands, right? It's something, your attorneys will always talk about. You want to look the best as you can. And sometimes that's sucking up a small change order so that you look good in front of a court, where you can make the argument, hey, I disagreed with this completely, but I did it anyway for the good of the project and getting it done.
And on the last point of remembering who your contract is with, I think this will ring true for a lot of the subs in the group, that sometimes when subs ask for additional money for change orders and things from the GCs come back and say, well, I've got to submit it to the owner. I've got to submit it to the owner. You got to wait. I got to submit it as a claim. At some point, if you're getting strung along too long, just remember that your contract is with that GC. It's not with the owner. So you may have to prosecute the claim against the GC directly if they keep stringing you along too far.
Right. And that's a great point, because ultimately, hey, you know what? The GC might have to pay up. And it is something that was not in scope with your contract with the GC, right? But the GC didn't include it in their bid to the owner. And you know what? That's not necessarily your problem.
That's like the famous scope gap problem, where if you're an HVAC contract and you say, hey, install this HVAC, add somebody to come in and make concrete pads for it, well, that's a scope gap problem. That's not necessarily on you to make concrete pads. So we'll talk a little bit about damages that you can include in your change orders, and this kind of gives some downside risk to the GCs and to the owners. Mike, do you want to run through them, or do you want me to run through them?
Yeah, sure. So, Kristen, we'll talk about that in a minute. All right. So as far as damages to include in your change orders, right? So you need to look at your contract and see if whether, at how they speak as to liquidated damages or consequential damages. Most contracts that run to GCs are gonna waive consequential damages between your claim as to a GC. Most contracts these days, I'm definitely seeing a push more towards consequentials than liquidated damages. And those can be phrased in different ways. They might say a contractor is liable for all damages. They might say a contractor is liable for actual damages. And so it's funny, most people don't know what that means. Actual damages, direct damages, consequential damages, special, indirect. And so you just want to be careful and really know what you're talking about. If it's actual damages, that's everything. That's just a pitfall for consequential damages. In my mind, it's better in many ways to have liquidated damages spelled out than to have consequentials. But in your change orders, you can include consequential damages to the extent it isn't already waived, via contract. You can have delay damages, although, as we know, that might not be viable for public works, attorney's fees. Big one is extended general conditions. Don't be a pig though with that. Reasonable. Breach of contract interest, lien interest, credit interest, increased bond costs. You can include your damages to get people's interest and attention, but ultimately this becomes a negotiation in many ways. And so, the objective is to try to be reasonable with everything.
Yep. And Kristen, I think that you're actually hitting on our next slide here, dealing with pay if paid and paid when paid clauses. So there are, if you read a AGC standard form contract or a DBIA standard form contract, there are almost like an infinite number of clauses that can affect cash flow. So we didn't make a 180 slide presentation on every single way, but here are kind of some of the other big ones that can affect cash flow. We'll kind of fly through them real quick. So we'll talk first about kind of what Kristen brought up in the chat there, which is pay if paid and pay when paid clauses. Now, pay if paid clause sounds like it's going to say, general contractor shall only pay subcontractor to the extent that owner has paid it. If you're a subcontractor and you see that in your subcontract, you've got to try and negotiate that out, and for no reason other than control. So if you've got a claim, if you're a subcontractor, you bumped into extra scope that you need to take care of, you're now hoping and relying on that general contractor to prosecute the claim against the owner. You may not know if that owner and that contractor work together all the time. They may be childhood friends. They may just do a lot of work together. So that general contractor is a little reluctant to come in on your behalf as a subcontractor and try and ask that owner for more money. A lot of states have gotten rid of pay if paid clauses. There's only a handful left that actually truly accept it. Arizona's one, Georgia's another. I believe Michigan and Maryland also allow it currently. But it's dying. It's kind of going out the window, which leads people into pay when paid clauses. And people get pretty cute with pay when paid clauses about it, and they try to morph them into a pay if paid clause. So a typical pay when paid clause will say contractor will pay subcontractor within a reasonable time. Now, if you see that in your subcontract, that's a red flag to you. What is a reasonable time? In my mind, that's 2 to 4 months after you've submitted your invoice to that general contractor. So make sure, if you can, spell out what a reasonable time is in your subcontract. Now, again, I said people get really cute with pay when paid clauses. Oh, sorry, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, well, Sean, I was just going to add, to the extent you make a payment bond claim, and I don't know how familiar this group is with payment bond claims, but to the extent you make a claim, the surety might not be able to make the same arguments as the contractor. So for instance, on a public project, we can't really, in most states, we can't make the argument it's pay if paid. Okay. So, and so if we can't make that argument, while our bonded principal might be able to make that argument, that's great, but they might still have to pay because we can't make that argument. And if we're liable, then our bonded principal is liable. Make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and going back to that, how sometimes people get a little cute with pay when paid. The case I'm going to talk about here actually came out of a payment bond claim. Sometimes you'll see a clause in your contract says pay when paid within a reasonable time. Say the parties agree that a reasonable time includes the opportunity for the GC to completely exhaust its remedies against the owner. Well, what does that mean? That means they've got 3, 4, 5, 6 years to file a lawsuit based on statute of limitations, and then they got to fight through some lawsuit, and then there's appeals. So you may be a subcontractor of a very small portion of a claim, right? It could be a $15 million claim, and you're looking for $250,000, but you can't get paid because the GC still wrote it into this much larger claim that they're prosecuting against the owner. So you may go 5, 6, 7 years without ever getting paid. Now in California, this is kind of unique to California, it's recent, a court struck down the exact language that's in red. It said, hey, that's really not what pay when paid should be. It starts infringing on some bond rights and things, but that language is dead in California. If you see it and you're in a different state, or you're contracting in a different state, that's a red flag. That's a red flag to you that you need to try and negotiate that out with your general. So I'll move on to number 2, because it's kind of it's a backdoor way that GCs use to try and get pay if paid back in. So they'll say, hey, if there's a claim, a subcontractor claim, you're limited to the recovery that we as a GC get from the owner. Functionally, that is a pay if paid clause. If you've got a $100,000 claim and the GC only gets $50,000 from the owner, because that's what they negotiate out, well, you should still get your $100,000 just because the GC only got 50. That's not your problem. But again, that's kind of a backdoor way to get pay if paid. You'll be successful in court if you challenge that as a pay if paid clause. Judges pick up on that pretty quickly. The number 3, blanket change condition waivers. So these are going to come up a couple different ways. You'll see them take a few different forms. You may see it overt and in your face as you waive all rights to change conditions because you've seen the site, or it may be something more innocuous. It'll say something like, plans and specifications are for bidding purposes only. So then when you get out and there's a differing site condition or there's an issue, your GC or your owner comes back and says, yeah, but the plans and specs were for bidding purposes only. You knew that. Come on. That's not enforceable. It's not enforceable in any state. You will most likely win that in court unless you get a really uneducated judge. It's called the Spearman Doctrine if you want to look it up later. But you will win that case. The problem with it is the reason why it's a cash flow issue is because while you're trying to educate this owner and this GC that this clause isn't enforceable, you're financing this project. It's not that easy to convince somebody, especially an owner, that the contract they're using is wrong. So that's how it comes up. So if you see some language like that in a contract with an owner or a GC, again, that's a red flag that you need to start having some conversations about what their intent is. And then number 4, we're almost getting to the end here. No damages for delay. I'll note that where I primarily practice out here in California, that's not allowed on a public contract or a public subcontract, but they are generally enforceable. And what it means is if your project gets delayed for 6 months and you've got to leave your equipment on site or you've got some material price escalation, and you can't go after that owner, you can't go after that GC for the delay damages. All you can do is get extra time. That's, in my opinion, generally a bad thing because very often those clauses go one way where the GC can't get delay damages from the owner, but the owner's perfectly fine getting liquidated damages from the GC. So again, that's a red flag. Check your state. If you see something like that, check with your state, check your statutes to see if that's actually enforceable. And finally, I'll touch real quickly on force account work. And force account work is, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but that's where you've got a dispute over the scope of your contract and somebody's forcing you to continue working. Again, now you've got to file a claim, take 6 months, you're financing this project. So if you see a clause that says you will work while there's an ongoing dispute in your contract, try and negotiate a limitation to it. Very often people are okay with having a 25% cap. So it'll read something like contractor or subcontractor shall not be required to work on force account if the reasonable value of that work is over 25% of the total contract. That way you're not financing some huge sum of money while you're trying to fight this claim. Slides here. All right, so, oh, go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to say, do we have time to go over the hypothetical still, or do?
I would defer to Justin on that.
Yeah, I think there's time if it's just going to be a minute here.
Yeah, we'll fly through it real quick.
This is kind of the end, right? So.
Yeah, so this is a real life example that we recently dealt with. Kind of ties all these principles together. So we had a tenant improvement contractor who was working on a building, and there was a flood 10 years ago, and they assumed when they bid the project for the tenant improvement that the cause of the flood was adequately fixed 10 years ago. Well, it wasn't. It kept leaking, caused a lot of wood rot. So lo and behold, they get into a claim with the owner telling them, well, you should have known that there could be wood rot, and you should have known that there was mold. So all of this is on you. You've got to work on force account. So our client ended up spending between new structural engineering, additional wood costs, which was expensive, and abatement contractor was spending about $250,000. The way this all tied together, when he was trying to get his retention when the project was done, and he's still fighting this claim, they're in court about $250,000. The owner wouldn't pay the retention back. All they kept saying was, we think there could be some defects, so we're withholding retention. In effect, my client was financing this project for $350,000. and combine that with maybe another job going bad somewhere. And that's when contractors start getting into financial trouble and cash flow becomes an issue. So that's kind of how these things pop up in real life. We're always happy to answer questions about it or answer any questions you may have about bonding. I think the next slide, I think, Justin, this one's you. Sorry.
Yeah. So I know we're going to have some time for questions here. I don't know if you can hear that thunder here, but before we get to some questions, I know I see some already rolling in, but I wanted to first say thanks to Sean and Michael for this extremely insightful presentation. I know I've learned a lot about, balance in the payment process for construction, and when it comes to that, that's what Levelset is in business for, is to kind of level that playing field in the construction payment process. And when it comes to like contracts and all these different things that come up across a project that you want an attorney to kind of help you navigate through, I just wanted to mention Levelset Legal Guard, which is a new service where we basically match you with a vetted construction attorney who, for kind of a subscription, flat subscription price, it includes some contract review, demand letters, mechanics lien review, and like a handful of other things, as well as just kind of developing that relationship where throughout a project you can, work together to navigate all of these things that pop up. So if you want to learn any more about that, just visit levelset.com/legalguard, and I'll make sure to follow up with a link to that after this. But otherwise, I'll turn it over to Sean and Michael for questions.
All right. Well, it looks like, Michael, you answered the question about liquidated damages versus consequential damages. And let's see if we have any other ones in there. Well, it looks like Mike was pretty active in answering this.
Yeah, so I would just add in, if anybody has a specific, bonding question, I would tell you to always talk to your agent and have your agent set you up with a phone call with your underwriter. I think that those can always be very powerful conversations and give you a lot of insight as to what a surety is thinking about. A lot of sureties are set up to review contracts and review bonds, and sort of give you insights, not necessarily from your perspective, but from how a bonding company looks at something.
And I think I'll add to Kristen's question about recovering extra contractual scope, even if there's a pay if paid or pay when paid clause. That's a pretty fact-specific question. If there's a pay if paid and pay when paid clause, you got to look at how the GC is going to prosecute that claim and what their obligations to prosecute that claim against the owner are. But those wouldn't be a specific bar to whether or not you can pursue extra contractual funds. All right, I think those are all our questions. Well, thank you all. Appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks everybody for coming. Thanks again, Sean and Michael. And for anyone who was here, we're going to send a recording out if you want to rewatch it. If you weren't here, I'll be sending that out tomorrow as well. So thanks again.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great day, everybody.